My name is Brian. I'm 32, and I'm an architect. My life is built on blueprints of precision and order, where every line has a purpose and every structure obeys the laws of logic. I live in Chicago, a city of steel giants and piercing winds, in a studio apartment on the 27th floor overlooking Lake Michigan. From up here, the world seems orderly and predictable. The straight streets, the symmetrical skyscrapers, the rhythmic flow of lights below, it all soothes the chaos that sometimes still rages inside me. That chaos comes from another city, from another time. It smells of damp earth after a downpour, of blooming magnolia, and of a quiet, lingering sorrow. It comes from New Orleans. Officially, it's my hometown, the place where I spent the first 18 years of my life. But in truth, I never felt at home there. My home, my real, warm, light-filled home, vanished when I was 7. It vanished along with my mother. The official version, the one I was fed my whole life, was brief and tragic, a car accident on a rainy evening. A simple, clean, and painless ending for the storytellers. But in my childhood memory, that day remained not a clear picture, but a blurry smudge, a feeling of wrongness, as if not one, but several key pieces had been removed from the puzzle. A year after her death, my father, Richard, married again. His choice was Catherine, a woman with perfectly coiffed blonde hair, a cold smile, and 2 children of her own, Julia and Mark. We moved into their large house in the Garden District, with its white columns, a sprawling veranda, and an old oak tree in the yard. On paper, we became one big family. In reality, I became an addition to an already existing structure, functional but foreign. My father, once the center of my universe, the man who taught me to draw and told me stories about the stars, slowly drifted away. He was consumed by his new life, his new wife, his new, complete children. He would look at me with an awkward guilt, as if my very existence were a constant reminder of a past he was desperately trying to rewrite. Catherine, however, never hid her feelings. For her, I wasn't a stepson, but rather an unfortunate inheritance from her husband's previous marriage. She was never openly cruel. Her weapon was not shouting, but cold indifference. She would praise Mark's drawings, admire Julia's ballet successes, but my achievements, whether winning a school math competition or an excellent project, were met with only a short, indifferent nod. "Well done, Brian," she would say, without looking up from her magazine, and the words sounded like a full stop, not an encouragement. I was a quiet boy. I learned to be invisible, to move through the house as silently as a shadow, so as not to disturb the harmony of their perfect family. Julia, who was a year older, and Mark, my age, quickly learned the rules of the game. I was not their brother. I was Brian, the guy who lived in the same house. They didn't bully me, but their world was closed to me. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, family picnics. I was physically present, but my soul remained outside, pressing its nose against the fogged-up glass, watching someone else's celebration. The only window to my former, real world was my Aunt Margaret, my mom's younger sister. She lived in a small, cozy house in the French Quarter, filled with the smell of chicory coffee, old books, and lavender. Once a month, my father would take me to her for the weekend, and those were the only days I could breathe deeply. Aunt Meg was the complete opposite of Catherine. She was loud, cheerful, with a mop of red curls that were always escaping her hairdo. She hugged me so tightly my bones creaked and called me my boy. In her house, I wasn't an addition. I was the main project. She kept all of my mom's things, her books with notes in the margins, her favorite guitar, her sketchbooks. Aunt Meg told me about her, not as a holy martyr, but as a living, cheerful, talented person. She said my eyes were the exact copy of my mom's, and that I had inherited her talent for drawing. It was Aunt Meg who gave me my first professional set of pencils and a large sketchbook. "Build worlds, Brian," she would say, "if you don't like the one you're living in." And I built them. I drew cities, bridges, houses where it was always bright and warm, where there were no cold stares or awkward silences. Architecture became my refuge, my language, my way of survival. Aunt Meg was the only one who hinted that the story of my mom's death wasn't so simple. Once, when I was about 15, we were sitting on her jasmine-covered balcony, and I asked why Dad never talked about Mom. Aunt Meg was silent for a long time, watching the passers-by below. Sometimes silence is louder than words, Brian, she finally said, her voice quiet and sad. There are things your father is afraid to say out loud. Maybe one day you'll be strong enough to hear the truth. But not now. Those words stuck with me. They were like a crack in the foundation of the official version, and I knew that one day I would have to look into that crack, no matter what it cost me. But back then, I was just a teenager who dreamed of escaping. And I did. I escaped to Chicago, to a world of glass and concrete, so different from the thick, secret-laden air of New Orleans. I thought I could build a new life on a new foundation. I was wrong. The foundation was the same, cracked, unreliable, laid in a distant childhood on the ruins of my first, real home. Childhood memories are not a film reel, but rather a collection of random photographs, some of which fade over time, while others, the most painful ones, remain frighteningly sharp. One such photograph in my memory is of me at 10 years old, standing at the doorway of my father's study. In my hands, I hold a freshly finished model of a bridge, which I spent 3 weeks gluing together from matchsticks and cardboard. It was my masterpiece, a complex arch structure inspired by bridges I had seen in books. I was so proud that my heart was pounding somewhere in my throat. My father was sitting at his massive oak desk, looking through some papers. Next to him stood Mark, showing him his drawing, a clumsily drawn tank with crooked tracks. "Amazing, son," my father exclaimed, his face glowing with genuine pride. "A real artist in the making. Catherine, look." Catherine, who was standing by the bookshelf, came over, cast an admiring glance at the drawing, and kissed Mark on the head. In that moment, I gathered my courage and stepped into the study. "Dad, look what I made," I stammered, holding out my bridge. My father tore his eyes away from Mark's drawing, his gaze sliding over my creation. His face showed nothing but slight annoyance, as if I had interrupted an important moment. "Yes, not bad, Brian. Neat. Just put it away, please. Don't clutter up the study. And be careful, the glue might stain the carpet." He turned away and focused again on Mark's tank. I stood there, stunned, holding my fragile bridge. The words "not bad" and "neat" sounded like a death sentence. My masterpiece, my pride, was just clutter in his eyes. I silently turned and went to my room. I didn't cry. Instead, a cold, heavy feeling grew inside me. I put the bridge on my desk, and then, in a fit of dull rage, I crushed it in my hands. The crunch of breaking matchsticks was the only sound in the silence. I swept the wreckage into the trash can and sat down at the desk. I felt nothing but emptiness. That wasn't the first time, nor the last. There was also the story of the swing. In the backyard grew a huge, old oak tree, and on one of its lower branches once hung a swing that my father had made for me when Mom was still alive. After her death, I would spend hours on it, swinging, looking at the sky, trying to hold her face in my memory. When Catherine moved in, she decided to beautify the backyard. The swing disappeared. In its place appeared a perfectly manicured lawn and flower beds with soulless roses. When I asked my father where the swing was, he looked away. Catherine thought it was old and unsafe. "Besides, you've outgrown it, Brian." I hadn't outgrown it. I was 9. That swing was the last physical thread connecting me to my mom in that house. They cut it down like a dead branch. The contrast with the time spent at Aunt Meg's was deafening. Her little house was my sanctuary. She never judged my drawings. She lived them with me. "Wow, what's this tower? I'd love to live at the very top, drinking my morning coffee while looking at the clouds," she'd say, and I'd immediately add a tiny balcony with a table to the top of the tower. She would pull out Mom's old sketchbooks, and we would look at them for hours. My mother was a talented watercolor artist. Her works were full of light and air, Louisiana landscapes, portraits of street musicians, still lives with flowers from her garden. "Look," Aunt Meg would say, pointing to one of the portraits, "she drew this of me. See how she captured the spark in my eyes. She knew how to see the light in people, and she saw it most of all in you." One day, in one of the sketchbooks, I found a small pencil sketch. A house on the ocean shore, simple, with large windows and a veranda overlooking the beach. Underneath the drawing was a caption, "Our dream house. Charleston." I asked my aunt what it was. "Oh, that was their dream, your dad's and hers," she sighed. "They were going to move there when, well, someday. Your mother adored Charleston. She said the air there was filled with history and salt, and it was the best place to raise children and grow old together." I looked at that simple drawing, and it seemed more real and desirable to me than the huge, cold house in the Garden District where I lived. That day, Aunt Meg first mentioned that wrongness. We were sitting in the kitchen, drinking tea and eating cookies, and I, mustering my courage, asked her directly, "Aunt Meg, did Mom really die in an accident?" She froze, her cup in her hand. Her cheerful eyes momentarily became serious and full of pain. She looked at me for a long time, as if weighing every word. "Brian, honey, the official version says yes. That's what everyone knows. That's what your father wants everyone to know." She paused. "But stories, like buildings, have not only a facade but also internal structures, hidden from view. Sometimes they are not as strong as they seem from the outside. Just know that your mother loved you very, very much. And she was a fighter. She fought until the very end." Those words explained nothing, but they changed everything. A fight. That word didn't fit with a simple car accident. What was she fighting? Or who? The thought settled in me like a slowly growing crack in a wall, and I knew that one day that wall would crumble, burying everything I thought was true. I continued to build my worlds on paper, but now they had a new element, a secret. I drew houses with hidden rooms, cities with intricate labyrinths of streets. I was trying to draw what I couldn't understand, to design a way out of the labyrinth of my own past. My teenage years in my father's house were like a long, cold rain. It was a time when the chasm between me and the rest of the family became insurmountable. Mark and Julia entered the world of school parties, first dates, and sports teams. They were popular, fit in, and were extensions of their parents. Handsome, successful, self-assured. I, on the other hand, remained on the periphery. My world was my room on the second floor, cluttered with art books, blueprints, and architectural magazines. I was Richard's strange son, the quiet, withdrawn boy who preferred the company of pencils and paper to his peers. My father seemed to have accepted this, but his eyes held a mixture of disappointment and awkwardness. He didn't know how to talk to me. Our conversations were limited to formal questions about grades and future plans. He would have liked to see Mark in me. Simple, understandable, playing football. But I was a complex equation he didn't want to or couldn't solve. My passion for architecture became my lifeline. It was the only thing that belonged entirely to me. When I sat down at my drafting table, the world outside my room ceased to exist. There was no cold politeness from Catherine, no noisy friends of Mark and Julia in the living room, no guilty look from my father. There were only lines, shapes, perspectives. I created spaces where I felt in charge. I built ideal homes where everyone had their own bright room, where the common living room was a center of warmth and comfort, not a stage for displaying social status. It was an escape, but at the same time, it was creation. I wasn't just running from reality. I was building an alternative one. The decision to leave New Orleans matured in me long before I graduated from high school. I longed for the anonymity of a big city, a place where no one would know that Brian, Richard Henderson's son. I wanted to start with a clean slate, one without the stains of others' expectations and disappointments. The choice of Chicago was no accident. It was a mecca for any aspiring architect, a city where the very air seemed to be saturated with the ideas of Mies van der Rohe and Frank Lloyd Wright. I applied to the Illinois Institute of Technology and, to my own surprise, was accepted with a partial scholarship for my portfolio. I remember the evening I announced it to the family at dinner. "I got into college in Chicago," I said, trying to keep my voice from trembling with excitement. There was silence. Mark and Julia exchanged blank looks. Catherine slowly dabbed her lips with a napkin. "Chicago," she said with slight bewilderment, as if I had announced a move to Mars. "That's so far away. And so cold." My father cleared his throat. "Well, it's a prestigious school," he said in a tone one might use to discuss stock market reports. "Catherine, and I thought you'd choose Tulane, stay closer to home." Closer to home. The phrase sounded like a joke. I was already as far away as one could be, living under the same roof with them. "I want to study architecture, and they have one of the best schools in the country," I replied, looking at my plate. "Well, it's your decision," my father concluded, and the conversation was over. No one asked if I was happy. No one congratulated me. My greatest triumph at that point was met with polite indifference. My freedom had no value to them. Aunt Meg was the only one who shared my joy. When I went to her to tell her the news, she screamed with delight, hugged me, and immediately started making plans to visit me in Chicago. "You're flying, my boy," she said, her eyes shining. "You're spreading your wings. Your mother would have been so proud of you." The evening before I left, she came to say goodbye. She brought me a gift, an old, worn leather case with a set of drafting tools that had belonged to her father, my grandfather. "They're old, but they're reliable," she said, placing it in my hands. "Just like our family. The part of it that's real." She hugged me at the door. "Remember, Brian, you can build the tallest skyscraper, but if the foundation is rotten, it will fall. Don't forget your roots. Don't forget her." The day of my departure was strangely quiet and mundane. My father gave me an envelope of money, awkwardly shook my hand, and muttered, "Good luck, son. Call sometimes." Catherine limited herself to a dry "take care." Mark and Julia didn't even come out of their rooms. I got into the taxi, and as the car pulled away from the house with the white columns, I felt not a drop of sadness. Only a huge, intoxicating relief. I looked out the window as the lush green streets of New Orleans gave way to the faceless highway. I was heading toward a new life, to a city of steel and glass, and I believed I could leave the past behind like an old, unnecessary blueprint. I was young and naive. I didn't know you can't run from your foundation. Wherever you go, you take it with you. Chicago greeted me with the roar of the L train, a wind that knocked me off my feet, and the indifference of a metropolis that at first felt like salvation. Here, I was a nobody, an anonymous unit in a crowd of millions, and this anonymity gave me freedom. No one knew my family history. No one looked at me with pity or hidden judgment. My identity was defined not by my past, but by my present, my work, my ideas, my work ethic. I threw myself into my studies. The university became the ideal world I had previously built on paper. Here, intelligence, talent, and hard work were valued. I spent nights in the workshops, creating models, perfecting blueprints, studying the works of the great masters. My professors saw potential in me, and their recognition was a balm for my old wounds. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged. I didn't seek out friends, but they appeared on their own. Other guys just as obsessed with architecture, with whom I could argue for hours about constructivism or functionalism while sipping cheap coffee in a 24-hour diner. I learned to laugh, to argue, to be part of a team. It was a fragile but real sense of belonging. My contact with my family in New Orleans dwindled to a minimum. Once every couple of weeks, I would call my father. Our conversations were short and formal. "How are you, Brian?" "Fine, Dad." "Studying?" "Need money?" "No. Thanks. I have a scholarship and a part-time job at the library." "Well, good. Catherine," and I say hello. End of conversation. They never asked about my projects, my successes. Their world continued to revolve around Julia, who had gone to university in Louisiana and become a sorority queen, and Mark, who had barely graduated high school and was now trying to find himself by burning through our father's money. I was a distant, self-sufficient, and therefore uninteresting project. My only lifeline to home remained Aunt Meg. We talked on the phone every week. She listened with genuine enthusiasm to my stories about my school projects, asked about my friends and life in Chicago. A couple of times a year, she would fly in to visit. Her visits were like a breath of fresh air. She brought the scent of New Orleans with her, spices from the French market, chicory coffee, and for a couple of days, my sterile Chicago apartment was filled with warmth and life. We would walk around the city, and I would proudly show her the buildings I admired. She knew nothing about architecture, but she listened to me with such attention, as if I were initiating her into the greatest mysteries of the universe. "You talk about buildings as if they're living things," she said once, as we stood at the base of the John Hancock Center. "They have a skeleton, a skin, a soul." Your mother used to talk about her paintings the same way. After graduating with honors, I easily found a job at one of Chicago's leading architectural firms. I started at the bottom, as a draftsman, but quickly moved up the career ladder. I was obsessed with my work. I came to the office before anyone else and left last. My designs were bold, precise, and functional. I slept 4 hours a night, ate on the go, and lived for my job. This was my proof. Proof to my father, to Catherine, to the whole world, but most of all, to myself. I was proving that I could build my own life, without their help, without their approval. And I was succeeding. By the age of 30, I was a lead architect in my department, with an excellent salary, the respect of my colleagues, and an impressive portfolio. I had built my Chicago fortress, a successful career, a stylish apartment, an ordered life. But at night, when the city's hum subsided, I would lie in my huge bed and feel a deafening emptiness. My fortress was impregnable, but it was cold and lonely inside. I had achieved everything I wanted, but I had never gotten rid of the feeling that I was an imposter, the boy with the broken matchstick bridge who had simply learned to build stronger structures. My rare trips to New Orleans for Christmas or Thanksgiving only worsened this feeling. I would arrive at my father's house like a guest. I was greeted politely, seated at the table, but I was a stranger. The conversations were about my father's business, Julia's new boyfriend, Mark's latest failed venture. My life, my successes in Chicago, were somewhere on the periphery of their universe. One Christmas, I came home and saw a huge portrait hanging on the living room wall. My father, Catherine, Mark, and Julia. The perfect family. I was not in that picture. I was not part of that facade. That night, I sat in my old room and looked out at the night city. I had achieved success, built a career, gained financial independence. But I had never built the most important thing, a home. Not a building of glass and concrete, but a place where you are loved and waited for. A place where you are not an addition, but part of the foundation. And the higher I built the walls of my Chicago fortress, the more acutely I felt that I was standing on a cracked foundation. I knew that sooner or later, I would have to go down into the basement of my past and see what had really destroyed my first home. But I kept putting it off, afraid of what I might find there. My father's 60th birthday was approaching. This event in the Henderson family was being prepared with a grandeur worthy of a coronation. Catherine took charge of the arrangements, and, judging by her rare but enthusiastic calls, it was to be the event of the year in New Orleans. Everyone was invited, my father's business partners, their high society friends, distant relatives. For me, this birthday became something of an obsession. I was 32, a successful, established man, and an irrational, almost childlike desire awoke in me to prove to them, to prove to my father, that I was worth something, that I wasn't just this strange son who had run away to Chicago. I decided that my gift had to be special, not an expensive accessory or a bottle of collectible whiskey, but something personal, something that could, as I naively thought then, melt the ice between us. The idea came to me suddenly, during a sleepless night. I decided to create what I did best, an architectural model, but not of an abstract building, but of our first home, the small, cozy house with the blue roof where we lived with my mother before she died. The house where I had been happy. I remembered it in the smallest detail. The crack on the porch step, the wisteria vines covering the veranda, the large window in the living room from which my mother loved to watch the sunset. Working on the model became an obsession for me. I put my current projects at the firm on hold, taking a short leave. My apartment turned into a workshop. I spent hours over blueprints, reconstructing the house's layout from memory. I ordered special materials to accurately replicate the texture of the old brick and wood. I laser-cut tiny window frames, created miniature furniture that I remembered from childhood. I even made the tiny swing in the backyard, the very one my father had later removed at Catherine's request. This was not just work, it was a therapy session. Every detail I recreated brought me back to a time when I felt loved and protected. I worked with such dedication, as if I were building a time machine. It seemed to me that if I could perfectly recreate this house, I could bring back a piece of that warmth, that connection with my father that we had lost. I imagined myself giving him this gift. How he would see it, and a genuine emotion, not polite indifference, would flicker across his face. How he would remember those years, remember my mother, remember me, his real, first son. It was a desperate and foolish hope, but I clung to it like a drowning man to a straw. A week before the birthday, the model was finished. It stood on a special podium in the center of my apartment, illuminated by a lamp. It was a masterpiece of detail and nostalgia. I ordered a special transparent acrylic dome and a wooden crate for transportation. I felt like Pygmalion in love with his creation. I believed that this little house possessed a magical power capable of fixing the past. Aunt Meg, to whom I sent photos of the model, called me in tears. "Brian, it's him. It's the very same house." Your mother would have been ecstatic. She would have said you didn't just build a house. You resurrected a memory. Her words strengthened my resolve. I was ready. I bought an expensive suit, a plane ticket, and with a sinking heart, I waited for the day I could present my project to the most important client of my life, my father. I understood the risk of my venture. It was all or nothing. Either this gesture would break down the wall of alienation, or I would shatter against it for good. But I had to try. I had to make this one last, desperate attempt to reach him, to bring back at least a shadow of the father I remembered and loved. I packed the model with the care of a sapper working with a bomb. Ironically, that's what it was. It was a time bomb, planted under the foundation of my own life. And I was carrying it myself to the epicenter of the explosion, to New Orleans, to my father's 60th birthday party. The house in the Garden District was buzzing like a disturbed beehive. Hundreds of guests in evening gowns and tuxedos filled the spacious rooms, sparkling with jewels and pearly white smiles. The air was thick with a cocktail of expensive perfume, champagne, and high society hypocrisy. I felt as out of place here as I had 20 years ago. I made my way through the crowd, carrying my precious crate, and found a quiet corner in my father's study to unpack the gift. In this setting, the model looked foreign and touching, like a wildflower in a Murano glass vase. My father was the center of attention, surrounded by guests, beaming and pleased. Catherine fluttered nearby, the perfect hostess of the evening. I waited for a moment when the music faded and the official toasts began. After speeches from his business partners and a toast from Mark, which was short and predictably foolish, I decided my time had come. With a pounding heart, I approached my father with the model in my hands. "Dad, happy birthday. This is for me." I placed the model on a small table next to a pile of other gifts. For a moment, there was silence. A few guests standing nearby peered curiously under the transparent dome. My father looked at the model. I stared at him, trying to catch the slightest spark of recognition, the slightest shadow of emotion. His face twitched for a second. I saw something in his eyes, surprise, confusion, maybe even pain. But it was just a moment. He quickly composed himself, his face resuming its polite mask. "Thank you, Brian. Very original," he said, and the word original sounded like a euphemism for strange. "You were always good at these sorts of things." He awkwardly patted me on the shoulder and immediately turned to a senator who had approached, engaging him in a conversation about golf. And that was it. My grand gesture, my time machine, my last hope was reduced to an original little thing. I stood as if nailed to the floor. The world around me continued to buzz and celebrate, but for me, it had shrunk to this small table, where my little house of memories stood forlornly next to boxes of cufflinks and cigars. Catherine walked over to the table, cast a fleeting, dismissive glance at the model, and said to her friend, loud enough for me to hear, "Brian is still playing with his toys. Cute, isn't it?" Her words were like a slap in the face. It wasn't just disregard, it was humiliation. Public, calculated, cruel. I felt the blood drain from my face. I wanted to say something, to object, but the words stuck in my throat. I silently turned and walked towards the exit, without saying goodbye. I needed air. I went out onto the veranda and stood in the shadow of the old oak tree. The noise of the party drifted from the open windows. I felt empty, burned out. All the illusions I had so carefully nurtured had turned to dust. At that moment, I heard voices from the slightly open window of the study. It was my father and Catherine. "Richard, you should have told him to put that thing away," Catherine was saying in an irritated whisper. "It's inappropriate. Why did he bring that reminder of the past here? Is he trying to ruin our party?" "Calm down, Catherine." My father's voice was tired and guilty. "It's just a gift. He didn't mean any harm." "No harm? Richard, he does it on purpose. He's always been like this, gloomy, withdrawn, a constant reproach to us. Sometimes I think he blames us for his mother's death." There was a pause. I held my breath. What I heard next destroyed the remnants of my world. "Stop it." My father's voice was barely audible. "No one is to blame for that. It was an accident. We agreed not to bring it up. About what happened before. About her. For our own good. For our family's sake. For our family's sake. You should have put him in his place long ago." Catherine snapped. "This house is our house. And he's still clinging to ghosts." Their voices faded as they moved away. I stood in the darkness, and my father's words, "We agreed not to remember." About her. Rang in my head like a funeral bell. Agreed. That one word explained everything. My mother's death was not just a tragedy. It was a secret, an agreement, a conspiracy of silence. And I, her son, was the main ghost they were so desperately trying to get rid of. In that moment, something inside me broke for good. There was no hope left, no resentment, no love. Only a cold, clear, ringing emptiness. I was no longer a part of their story. I realized I needed to find out my own. I turned and walked away from that house, from that party, from that lie. I walked through the night streets of New Orleans, not caring where I was going. I knew only one place where I would be told the truth. I was going to Aunt Meg's. I reached the French Quarter on foot. My feet were aching, my expensive suit was wrinkled, and my head was in a fog. I knocked on Aunt Meg's door until she finally opened it, sleepy, in her robe. Seeing me on her doorstep, pale, with burning eyes, she understood everything without a word. She didn't ask any questions. She just let me in, made me a strong cup of tea, and sat me down in a chair in the kitchen. I was silent, unable to utter a word, just staring at a single point. Aunt Meg sat across from me and waited. She always knew how to wait. Finally, I was able to speak. My voice was hoarse and alien. I told her everything. About the model, about my father's reaction, about Catherine's words, about the conversation I had overheard. When I finished, tears were streaming down my cheeks. For the first time in many years, I cried without hiding it. They were not tears of resentment, but of bitter revelation. They made an agreement, Aunt Meg, I whispered. They agreed to forget her. What does that mean? Tell me the truth. All of it. I can't live in a lie anymore. I have to know. Aunt Meg looked at me long and hard. Her eyes were filled with infinite sadness and resolve. I promised your mother I would tell you when you were ready, she said quietly. I thought that time would never come. I was wrong. You are ready. You have the right to know. She stood up and left the room. She returned a few minutes later, holding an old wooden box I had never seen before. She placed it on the table in front of me. The box was made of dark wood, unadorned, but with a small brass lock. Aunt Meg took a tiny key from her robe pocket and opened it. Inside were several notebooks with worn covers, a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and a few photographs. These are your mother's diaries, Aunt Meg said, her voice trembling. The last 2 years of her life. She asked me to keep them for you. She wanted you to one day learn her story not from others, but from her. I looked at these notebooks as if they were sacred relics. My hands trembled as I reached out and took one. The cover was blue cardboard, inscribed with a familiar, elegant handwriting. It was my mother's voice, locked away for 25 years in this box. I'll be here, Brian, Aunt Meg said. Read. If you have questions, I'll answer them. But first, you need to hear her. I opened the first notebook. The date was 2 years before her death. The first pages were full of light and happiness. She wrote about her love for my father, about her dreams, about a funny little boy me. She described our walks, my first drawings, our plans for the future, for that house in Charleston. I read, and my heart felt both warm and unbearably painful. This was the mother I vaguely remembered, loving, bright, alive. But gradually, the tone of the entries began to change. Notes of anxiety and confusion appeared. Richard has changed. He's staying late at work, he's distant, cold. When I try to talk to him, he brushes me off, says I'm imagining things. Then a name appeared. Catherine. At first, just in passing, Richard's new assistant, very efficient. Then more and more often. They had lunch together. He said it was for work. She called him late at night. He went into another room to talk. I read, and an icy horror gripped my heart. I was witnessing my mother's world crumble, page by page. She described her pain, her loneliness, her attempts to save her marriage. I talked to him. He denies everything. He looks me in the eyes and lies. He calls me hysterical, says I'm overreacting. I'm starting to go crazy. Maybe he's right. Maybe I made it all up. I looked up at Aunt Meg. She was looking at me, tears in her eyes. She didn't make it up, she whispered. I saw it. I told her to leave him, to take you and leave. But she loved him. She believed she could fix everything. I plunged back into the reading. The following entries were filled with despair. It was a chronicle of betrayal. My father was home less and less. Catherine had become an integral part of his life. My mother wrote about sleepless nights, about tears, about fear for my future. I have to be strong for Brian. I have to smile, pretend everything is okay. But inside, I am a barren wasteland. At that moment, I understood what fight Aunt Meg had been talking about. She wasn't fighting a disease. She was fighting lies, betrayal, the destruction of her world. She was fighting for her family, for her love, for her sanity. And she was losing that fight. I turned the page and saw an entry made a week before her death. The handwriting was uneven, broken. I can't do this anymore. He told me today that he loves her, that he wants to be with her. He asked for a divorce. He wants to take everything from me. My life, my home, my son. I won't give him Brian. I will never give him up. He is mine, my light, my only reason to live. The last entry was dated the day of her death. Just one line, written in large, desperate letters. I can't cope. Forgive me, my boy. I closed the diary. The room was filled with a deafening silence, broken only by my own ragged breathing. The truth was more terrifying than any of my suspicions. The car accident was not an accident. It was a finale, the curtain falling on a tragedy played by 3 people, and 2 of them had agreed to forget it, agreed to build their new happy life on my mother's bones. The air in Aunt Meg's small kitchen grew thick and heavy, as if the very walls had absorbed the pain seeping from the diary's pages. I sat motionless, holding the notebook that felt red-hot in my hands. The words, "Forgive me, my boy," were branding my soul. This wasn't suicide in the classic sense. This was a murder committed without a weapon. A murder of someone's will, someone's hope, someone's soul. So what happened that day? I asked, my voice hollow and lifeless. Aunt Meg took a deep breath, gathering her strength. Her story was the supplement to what I had just read, the horrific details that never made it onto the diary's pages. That day, she called me. Aunt Meg began, her gaze fixed on the past. She was hysterical. Richard had packed his bags and left that morning. Just left a note on the kitchen table. He had gone to Catherine. Your mother was crushed. She said she couldn't live, that her world had collapsed, that he had taken everything from her. I begged her to wait for me, told her I was on my way. I dropped everything and drove to your house. But by the time I got there, it was too late. She paused, swallowing a lump in her throat. She got in the car. Where she was going, nobody knows. Maybe to him, to have a fight. Maybe just anywhere, to escape the pain. It was raining hard. The police said she lost control on the wet road and swerved into oncoming traffic. The car hit a truck. She died instantly. Aunt Meg looked me straight in the eye. Brian, the police report says accident. But I know your mother. She was an excellent driver. That day, she couldn't see the road through her tears. She was driven to that state. Richard and Catherine broke her. They knew about her depression, how vulnerable she was. But they didn't care. They wanted to be together, and she was an obstacle in their path. I listened to her, and the picture came together. My father's lies, Catherine's coldness, their agreement to forget. It was all not just an attempt to hide the ugly truth of an affair. It was a way to bury their guilt. They built their family on the ruins of my mother's life, and they left me as an inconvenient reminder, a living ghost that had to be walled off with indifference. I opened the bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. They were my mother's letters to Aunt Meg. They contained even more pain, even more details of her and my father's falling out. She wrote about how Catherine deliberately humiliated her, how my father became increasingly distant and cruel. I read and understood that my life in their house, my feeling of being an outsider, was just an echo of the war they had waged against my mother. I was her son, her copy, and so I had to be pushed aside, devalued, made invisible. I took the last photograph from the box. It was of my mother, sitting on a beach, laughing, squinting in the sun. Next to her sat a little boy, me, building a sandcastle. She looked so alive, so happy. This photograph was from another world, from the life that had been taken from me. I looked at my smiling mother, and what rose in me was not only grief but a cold, hard anger. Not a hysterical rage, but a calm and focused one. An anger that demanded not revenge, but justice. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked Aunt Meg. I gave my word, she replied. She was afraid this truth would break you when you were a child. She wanted you to grow up, to become strong. She believed that one day you would sense the lie yourself and start looking for answers. And she was right. I kept this box for you, like the most precious treasure. This is your inheritance, Brian. Not just the pain, but her love. Look how much she wrote about you. You were her son, her anchor. She fought for you. I opened the diary again and found the pages where she wrote about me. Brian drew a castle today. He said we would live in it together and no one would hurt us there. My little protector. He fell asleep on my lap. I watched his eyelashes and thought that as long as I have him, I can endure anything. These words were both a burn and a healing. I was not the cause of her death. I was the reason she had lived for so long. I sat up all night in Aunt Meg's kitchen, rereading the diaries, sorting through the letters and photographs. I immersed myself in my mother's story, in her pain, in her love. By morning, the fog in my head had cleared. In its place was a crystal clarity. I knew what I had to do. I was no longer a victim, a little boy seeking approval. I was my mother's son, and I had to make my father look into the eyes of the ghost he had so diligently tried to ignore all these years. I had to make him remember her. The next day, I called my father. My voice was even and cold, like Chicago ice. We need to talk. Alone. Meet me at the cafe in the French Quarter in an hour. I didn't ask. He didn't object. There was a note in my tone that didn't allow for refusal. I chose an old, dimly lit cafe with the patina of time on its walls, a place where he and my mother, as I had learned from the diaries, used to go. I arrived early and sat at a table in the farthest corner. The box with the diaries lay on the seat beside me. When my father walked in, he looked tired and annoyed. The party gloss had worn off, leaving just an old man, displeased at being pulled from his usual comfort. "Brian, what's so urgent?" "I have a lot to deal with after yesterday," he began, sitting down opposite me. I didn't answer. I silently opened the box, took out one of the notebooks, and placed it on the table in front of him. "Recognize this?" I asked quietly. He looked at the blue cover, and his face changed. The mask of confidence cracked, and fear showed through. He stared at the diary as if it were a snake poised to strike. "Where did you get this?" he rasped. "The same place I got her eyes," I replied, holding his gaze. "Aunt Meg kept them. For me. I've read everything, Dad. Every word." He turned pale. His hands, resting on the table, trembled slightly. He tried to regain his composure. "Brian, this is the past. Why are you digging up what's long dead and buried? She's dead, but you didn't bury her. You betrayed her, broke her, and then made a deal with her rival to pretend she never existed. You built your cozy little world on her bones, and your only problem was me, a living reminder of your crime." My words fell into the cafe's silence like stones. He flinched at the word crime. "Stop it." His voice dropped to a whisper. "It was an accident. I loved your mother. Loved her." I gave a bitter laugh. "I read about how you loved her, how you lied to her face, called her hysterical when she begged you for the truth, how you left her for another woman, leaving her alone, crushed, on the verge of a breakdown. Is that what you call love?" He lowered his head, unable to meet my eyes. All his feigned importance, all his respectability, had vanished. Before me sat a weak, frightened man. "I didn't want it to end like that," he muttered. I was confused. "Catherine, she was different. Strong, confident. And your mother, she had become so fragile, so unhappy. She became that way because of you." I raised my voice, and a few patrons turned to look. "You drained all the life out of her, and then you complained that the vessel was empty. You found a new, shiny toy and threw away the old one that dared to break." I opened the diary to the last page and turned it towards him. "Forgive me, my boy," I read aloud. "She wrote this on the day she died. She was asking me for forgiveness because she couldn't bear the pain you caused her." "And who did you ask for forgiveness, Dad? Did you ever go to her grave and say I'm sorry? Or was that also part of your agreement with Catherine not to disturb the ghosts?" He was silent. A tear rolled down his cheek. The first tear I had seen on his face in 25 years. But it didn't stir any pity in me. It was too late. "I'm not asking you for anything," I said, my voice calm again. "I'm not asking for apologies or remorse. I don't need them. I just wanted you to know that I know. That I'm no longer the little boy who can be pushed aside, silenced with a gift, or ignored. I am Elizabeth Henderson's son, and I remember her, even if you chose to forget." I stood up, leaving the diary on the table. "You can burn it, just like you tried to burn her memory. But it won't change anything. The truth lives in me now." I put money for the coffee on the table, turned, and walked towards the exit without looking back. I could feel his eyes on my back, but he no longer had any power over me. Stepping out of the cafe into the sun-drenched street, I took a deep breath. I didn't feel relief or joy. I felt that I had completed the most important project of my life. I had restored a ruined foundation, not to build on it again, but to push off from it, and, finally, to fly. I walked through the French Quarter, and for the first time in many years, I didn't feel like a ghost in this city. I felt like a part of it. My mother's son. A free man. When I returned to Chicago, I realized I couldn't stay there anymore. My perfectly designed apartment, my prestigious job, this whole world of glass and concrete that I had considered my fortress, now felt alien and meaningless. It was a stage set I had hidden behind to avoid the truth. Now that the truth was out, the set had crumbled. I walked into my office the next day and handed in my resignation. My boss was shocked. He begged me to stay, offered me a promotion, a new project, a vacation. He didn't understand that it wasn't about the job. It was about me. I could no longer design cold, soulless skyscrapers for corporations. I needed to build something real. I sold my apartment, most of my furniture, and my belongings. I kept only the essentials: my books, my grandfather's drafting tools, and, of course, the box with my mother's diaries. I felt light, freed from the burden of material things that had defined my status for so long. I didn't know exactly what I would do next, but I knew where I was going. One word echoed in my head, like an echo from the past, like my mother's last wish. Charleston. The city from her sketch, the city of her dreams. I had to go there. For her, and for myself. Aunt Meg fully supported my decision. "You're doing what she always wanted," she said on the phone, her voice filled with pride. "You're going to build your dream house." I asked her to look after my mother's grave. "Always, my boy. Always," she replied. I didn't say goodbye to my father. After our meeting in the cafe, he had tried to call, sent messages. I didn't answer. I had nothing to say to him. Our story was over. Maybe someday, many years from now, I would be able to think of him without pain, but for now, I needed distance. Physical and emotional. I got into my old car, placed a box with my most precious things on the passenger seat, and drove southeast. The road from Chicago to Charleston was long and became a kind of pilgrimage for me. I drove through states. The landscapes outside the window changed, and with every mile I traveled, I felt like I was shedding my old skin. I was leaving behind Brian the architect from Chicago, Brian the son of Richard Henderson. I was driving towards just Brian. Charleston greeted me with warm, humid air, the scent of salt and blooming jasmine. This city was the complete opposite of Chicago. Instead of steel giants, there were elegant three-story houses with balconies and shutters. Instead of the roar of the subway, the clatter of hooves from horses pulling tourist carriages. The city was steeped in history, dignity, and a certain southern slowness. I immediately felt at home here. I rented a small apartment in the historic center, with high ceilings and creaky wooden floors. For the first few weeks, I just walked around the city, soaking in its atmosphere. I would sit for hours on the waterfront, looking at the ocean, trying to imagine my mother sitting there next to me. I found the exact view she had sketched in her album. It was a beach on Sullivan's Island, with white sand and a view of the old lighthouse. I sat there until sunset, and it felt as if she were with me. Gradually, I began to think about the future. I had savings that would allow me not to work for about a year. I decided not to look for a job in a large firm. I wanted something of my own, something meaningful. The old houses of Charleston caught my attention. Many of them were in a dilapidated state, in need of restoration. In this, I saw my mission. Not to build new, but to restore the old. To breathe new life into something that had history and soul. It was the perfect metaphor for my own life. I registered my small firm, naming it Elizabeth Designs in honor of my mother. I found a small workshop and started taking on my first orders. At first, they were small projects, consultations, designing a veranda, restoring antique plasterwork. I worked alone, putting not only my professional knowledge but also my entire soul into each project. I wasn't chasing profit. I was chasing meaning. I got to know people, listened to the stories of their homes, their families. I was becoming part of this city, its living fabric. One day, while working on the restoration of an old house on Church Street, I found an old inscription scratched into the wall under a layer of wallpaper. "Home is where the heart is." I stood and looked at those words, and tears came to my eyes. I finally understood what I had been searching for all these years. I wasn't just building buildings. I was building homes. And in the process, I had finally built my own. Not of brick and wood, but of forgiveness, acceptance, and love for the woman who gave me life and a dream. I was home. In Charleston. 5 years passed. 5 years of a slow, meaningful life in Charleston. My firm, Elizabeth Designs, had grown from a small workshop into a respected bureau specializing in historical restoration. We didn't chase large, profitable projects. Our reputation was built on meticulously restored details, respect for history, and a love for old walls that held the memories of generations. I had assembled a small team of like-minded individuals, enthusiasts like myself, for whom architecture was not a business, but an art. My life found a rhythm I had never had before. In the morning, I would drink coffee on my bougainvillea-covered balcony, watching the city wake up. During the day, I would be at job sites, breathing in the dust of centuries, or sitting over blueprints in my bright office overlooking an old church. In the evenings, I would walk along the waterfront, read, or meet with friends. I had made friends. Real, close people with whom I could talk not just about work, but about life. They were my clients who had become friends, local artists, bookstore owners. Simple, sincere relationships, unburdened by expectations and social conventions. Aunt Meg would visit me from New Orleans several times a year. She fell in love with Charleston and each time brought a piece of home with her, spices, jazz records, and endless stories. She was thrilled with my work. "You don't just restore houses, Brian," she would say, inspecting another of my projects. "You heal them. You give them back their dignity. Your mother would be so happy to see this." We often talked about her. But now, there was no sharp pain or bitterness in those memories. There was a gentle sadness and gratitude. I had learned to live with her legacy, not as a burden, but as a guiding star. Her diaries and letters lay in my desk, and I would sometimes reread them to remind myself of the path I had traveled. It was my reminder of the value of truth and the fragility of human life. I hadn't spoken to my father all these years. After I left, he had tried to get in touch a few times, but I wasn't ready. I didn't hold a grudge against him, at least not that all-consuming rage. It had given way to a quiet, deep disappointment. I realized that some things can't be fixed. Some chasms are too deep to build bridges over. I forgave him not for his sake, but for my own. I let him go so that he would no longer have power over my life. From Aunt Meg, I knew that things were not going well in their family. My father's business was in decline. Mark continued to get involved in shady ventures, losing money. Julia had married a wealthy heir and barely spoke to her parents. The perfect facade of their family had cracked and was slowly crumbling. I listened to this news without schadenfreude, just with a detached understanding that a foundation built on lies cannot be strong. I had found peace. Not the sterile order I had in Chicago, but a real, inner peace. I had learned to enjoy simple things: the morning sun, the taste of fresh fish, a conversation with a friend. I realized that success is measured not by the height of the buildings you construct, but by the depth of the moments you live. One day, while restoring a house built in the early 19th century, I found a time capsule sealed in a wall, a small tin box. Inside were children's drawings, a few coins, and a letter from the first owner of the house to his future descendants. He wrote about his hopes, his love for this home, and how the real value is not the bricks, but the laughter that echoes within these walls. I read the letter to my team, and we all fell silent, moved by this message from the past. In that moment, I felt like a link in a long chain. I wasn't just building and restoring. I was preserving stories. And at the same time, I was writing my own. A story about a boy who lost his home, only to learn, many years later, how to build it for others and finally find it within himself. I was no longer a stranger. I was a keeper of memories, a keeper of beauty, and a keeper of my own hard-won happiness. One autumn evening, as I sat in my office sorting through old blueprints, the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, from New Orleans. I hesitated, but something made me answer. "Hello, Brian." The voice on the other end was female, uncertain, but vaguely familiar. It was Julia. We hadn't spoken in over 7 years. "Yes, it's me," I replied, feeling the muscles in my back tense up. "Brian, I don't know how to say this. Dad had a stroke. He's in the hospital. It's serious." She spoke quickly, her words tumbling out. "Catherine left him a year ago. Moved to Florida with some new guy. Mark. Mark is out of town, and he's useless anyway. I'm alone. The doctors say he might not make it. He keeps asking for you." I was silent, processing the information. The picture was clear. The ship was sinking, and all the rats had fled. Only the captain and his daughter were left, and she was panicking, calling the last known number for the rescue service. He wants to see you, Brian. Her voice broke. Please come. Two feelings battled inside me. The part of me that remembered the pain and humiliation wanted to say no. To say that he had made his choice many years ago, that he didn't deserve my presence. But another part, the one that had found peace in Charleston, the one that had learned forgiveness, whispered otherwise. It wasn't a question of duty or love. It was a question of humanity, and a question of closure. I had to close this final door. I'll be there tomorrow, I said and hung up. I called Aunt Meg. She already knew everything. Are you sure you want this? She asked with concern. Yes, I replied. But not for him. For me. The next day, I was in New Orleans. The city greeted me with the same humid heat, but I saw it with different eyes. The hospital room smelled of antiseptics and sickness. On the bed lay a withered, pale old man, tangled in wires. I wouldn't have recognized him as my father, the powerful, self-assured Richard Henderson. He was broken, physically and morally. Julia sat beside him, her face pale and exhausted. When she saw me, she burst into tears. My father opened his eyes. His gaze was cloudy, but he recognized me. He tried to say something, but only an incoherent sound came from his mouth. One of his arms was paralyzed, but with the other, he made a weak gesture towards me. I walked over and sat in the chair next to the bed. I felt neither hatred nor pity, only a kind of universal sadness. He looked at me, and his eyes filled with tears. In that helpless gaze was everything: regret, remorse, a plea. He was finally looking at me. For real. Without a mask, without lies. But it was too late. I sat with him for several hours. I said nothing, just stayed by his side. I thought about my life. About the boy who built a bridge from matchsticks. About the teenager who ran away to Chicago. About the man who found the truth in old diaries. And about who I had become now. I realized that my strength was not in hating him, but in rising above that hatred. He died 2 days later. I stayed for the funeral. There were few people, a couple of old colleagues and distant relatives. Catherine didn't come. Mark showed up at the very end, looking disheveled and out of place. After the funeral, Julia gave me a letter that my father had dictated to her a few weeks before the stroke. In it, he asked for my forgiveness. For everything. For my mother, for Catherine, for my childhood. He wrote that he had spent his whole life chasing success and was afraid of being weak, and that fear had destroyed everything real in him. He wrote that my model of the house was not an original little thing, but a blow to the heart that he couldn't bear. He wrote that he was proud of me. I read the letter and folded it carefully. Those words could no longer hurt me, but they couldn't heal old wounds either. They were just words. A period at the end of a long sentence. Returning to Charleston, the first thing I did was drive to the beach, to the very spot from my mother's sketch. I watched the ocean for a long time, the endless horizon. My journey had brought me here. I didn't become who others wanted me to be. I became myself. My story is about how the strongest buildings are built on an honest foundation. That family is not about blood or a name, but about the choice to love and support. That the past cannot be changed, but it can be accepted so that it no longer defines your future. If I could give advice to someone who, like me, feels like an outsider, I would say, don't be afraid to seek the truth, no matter how painful it may be. It might destroy your world, but only so you can build your own, real one on its ruins. Find your people, those who see the light in you, and build. Build your life, your relationships, your inner home. Line by line, stone by stone. I looked at the sun setting into the ocean, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt completely whole. I, Brian Henderson, my mother's son, the architect of my own soul. I was home.